For as long as I can remember, I've really liked airplanes. I liked flying in them. I liked watching them. All kinds of nonsense. When I was in elementary school, I had to write a biography of someone important in history. And maybe it was middle school. I can't actually remember. I think it was in elementary school. But I wrote it on the Wright brothers, the people who invented the first powered thing that goes in the air and doesn't come down right away. I mean, the first flight was shorter than a 747, but it went up and it didn't come down right away. So it was something big. And I do remember that paper was the longest thing ever. It couldn't have been longer than about 2 pages, but it was impossibly long. I was scarred for how long that horrific paper was. And then all the while, my History of Christianity term paper is laughing at me. That was about 15 pages on the history of celibacy in the church. Let me tell you, the Wright brothers were a lot more interesting. Now, I'm not entirely sure where this love of airplanes came from, but I still remember, and I can picture the awful graphics of the first flight simulator video game I ever played. And it was Sublogic's Flight Simulator 2 on the best computer ever to hit the market ever, the Commodore Amiga. It's a fantastic thing. It was better than anything that was out there in the late 80s, early 90s. And ever since then, I've kind of stuck around with various flight simulators here and there through the Microsoft series until it got terrible. And then tried a couple other ones, but they all either make you have a whole slew of fancy contraptions to be usable, or they are just terrible. So there's not much of a market for flight simulators anymore. But the other thing that I also really liked was, and this shows what kind of special person I am. I own 3 air traffic control simulator programs. 3 of them. One is an awful one that's from the mid-'80s, that it's just the planes are little V's of 3 pixels, and the radar screen is a very, very vague circle. And some of the other ones are more fancy, but this is something I do in my free time. I'm crazy. No one would subject themselves to that willingly, for fun. But one of the things that I used to make my parents do when I was in school, because I loved airplanes so much, is I'd make them take me to the airport so I could break out my trusty Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles camera, which put a little thing of Michelangelo in the lower right-hand corner of every picture, which I thought was neat, because he was my favorite, of course. And so we'd go to the airport, and sometimes it was the big airport in Windsor Locks, sometimes it was a little airport, but I'd just go around and I'd take pictures of planes. And I had a book, and I'd look at them, and it's like, oh, I've got this one. And I was like, oh, I don't have this one. This is new. And it was just fun. I loved it. Can you imagine doing that now? You would either get looked at really weird or get arrested. Because they don't let you just take a camera into an airport anymore. They would tend to frown on that kind of behavior. And obviously this was before the days when you had to have a boarding pass to get into security. I mean, we just walk right through into the terminal, find a spot where you had a good view of the runway and just watch the planes go up, go up, go up, go down, go down, go down. It was great fun. Well, it was great fun for me. My parents might have been a little bit bored, but it was great fun for me. Now, one thing I miss from that era, when you could actually go into the airport terminal and see people off, is exactly that. It's always interesting to watch when folk are seen off or when folk come back from a really long trip. And if you've ever flown out of Salt Lake Airport when a missionary is coming or going, you know exactly what that looks like. I mean, you'll have a whole herd of people gathered around either with a sign saying, good luck, Elder so-and-so, or a sign that says, welcome back, Elder so-and-so, usually in the language of wherever it is they're going. But can you imagine how difficult that would be for a parent? You're sending your kid away for 2 years where you're really only going to talk to them in letters. I mean, there's some pretty hefty emotions that are going to be involved there. So you can understand why they would want to gather and they would want to send off their missionary or receive their missionary back after 2 years of not seeing them. And I can imagine Jesus' disciples having the same kind of emotions when Jesus ascends into heaven. And you can almost picture it like it happened at an airport. I mean, Jesus is at the gate, because this always happens to me at airports, and I don't know if it happens to you either, but Jesus is at the gate, and you're just kind of hanging out, and it feels like you're waiting forever for your row to be called, because you're never the first one. You're never the second one. If you're unlucky, you might be the third one, because that means you're at the back of the plane, and no one likes being at the back of the plane. So I can picture, Jesus and the disciples at the gate, and Jesus was ready to get on the plane, but his disciples don't really know that he's getting on the plane. I know the analogy starts to break down after a minute. But Jesus starts talking to him, and he says, hey, Holy Spirit's going to show up. You're going to be my witnesses, starting at Jerusalem, into Judea, into Samaria, and into the whole world, but don't do anything until the Holy Spirit shows up. And then as quick as that, it says, now general boarding for the flight to heaven, and off Jesus goes down to the jetway, and the disciples are left going, wait, what just happened? That was quick. Where'd he go? And then, of course, at this point, when the two guys show up and say, hey, he's going to come back, don't stress out too much, just do what he said, then that's, normally somebody doesn't show up and say, hey, he's going to be back eventually. But here's where the problem came in. The disciples have no idea when he's going to be back, so they kind of assumed it was just a weekend trip. And then a weekend trip turned into a month, and then a month turned into a year, and then a year turned into a decade, and a decade turned into a lot longer than a decade. And the disciples are going, he's not back yet. Maybe we should write some of this down. And that's why if you notice, there's a whole bunch of, all the Gospels start getting written around about 80, 60 to 70-ish, after they kind of started to think, the people who knew Jesus are starting to die, we better write down the stuff that he said. So the disciples did what Jesus said to do. They hung out in Jerusalem for just about a week, more like 10 days, really. By the by, while we celebrate Ascension today, it was actually Thursday. It's 40 days after Easter, and then 10 days later, you have the celebration of the 50th day, Pentecost, which just means 50th party, pretty much. So, what do the disciples do? Right after Jesus pops off into heaven, they go to church. Did you notice that in the gospel? Jesus ascends into heaven, and all of a sudden they go to the temple and they worship. Jesus leaves, and they go straight to church. I've always thought that was weird. Like, in Acts, they don't go straight to church. In Acts, I think the next thing they do is they start drawing lots to pick who's going to replace Judas. But in Luke, they go straight to church. Now, that's not a bad idea, really, because Jesus said, hang out in Jerusalem until the Holy Spirit shows up. And so they thought, well, if we're in Jerusalem, we may as well hang out at the temple. And then, of course, 10 days later, their hair catches on fire. They start speaking in tongues, and 3,000 people decide to follow Jesus that day. We'll talk about that next week, though. So I don't want to get ahead of myself, because if I talk about that this week, then what am I going to talk about on Pentecost? So now, where does that leave us? Jesus has gone into heaven. We're here at church worshiping God, just like the disciples did. And we're still waiting for Jesus to come back. So what do we do in the meantime? While we're waiting for Jesus to come back, what do we do? Well, we do what he told us to do. Hang out in church until the Holy Spirit shows up. And then, starting in your town, and then in your state, and then into your country, and then into the whole world. Be his witnesses. That's it. Show people what Jesus is like. Show them what he's all about. Wait, that doesn't sound like anything new. What did it say in Genesis chapter 1 towards the end? I'll create them in my image. Male and female, I'll create them, and I'll give them dominion over all the stuff. This isn't a new job that Jesus gave his disciples. It's always been our job to show the world what God is like. And we've always done a pretty terrible job at it. Here's where we luck out, because we have a bonus. What is it that Jesus says is going to happen before they should go out and be his witnesses? Somebody whispered it. The Holy Spirit. Their hair's going to catch on fire. They're going to start speaking in tongues, and 3,000 people will follow Jesus that day. We also have the Holy Spirit. Most of us haven't had such a dramatic experience as what happened on the day of Pentecost, but the Holy Spirit is still in our lives. It's one of the promises that we're given when we're baptized. It's one of the things that God says, the Holy Spirit's going to be with you. Even though I'm going away, I being Jesus, I'm leaving you the Holy Spirit, like we heard last week in the gospel. And so we have this help. We have help to keep us on the right path and to help us to show the world what Jesus is like. And so today, when we remember Jesus ascending to the Father's side, we also remember this promise that even though he's not physically with us anymore, he isn't gone. Even though he's gone off to prepare a place for us, the Holy Spirit reminds us of his presence every day and guides us and teaches us and helps us to be the best witnesses of who God is that we can possibly be.